Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another 67 from Home webinar. I'm coming to you live from the virtual club here in Singapore, as usual. I was in the offices today with our Chief Operating Officer, Niels, who is based here in Singapore. We were receiving a delivery of Zalto glasses, which we're going to be offering to members very soon, 3 whole pallets worth of the finest glassware. So that was quite exciting to be able to do some development for the club. Otherwise, the space which you're looking at behind me is currently a big empty box. There are workmen up there every day, and we hope to get access to the site in September so that we can start showing you around again. But of course, the club opening has been delayed, and we're looking at kind of the mid of 2021 probably before we get opened. But that's besides the point. Today we are here to talk about Bordeaux and value. If you haven't attended one of these webinars before, please get in touch with us by using the chat box. Just click on the chat icon and you can share your comments with me and the other attendees. If you have any questions specifically for me, use the Q&A function and I'll get to those towards the end of this webinar. As you, I'm sure, are aware by now, we have many webinars coming to you every day, up to 5 daily, and you can find all the details at 67poundmile.com/virtual-events. So check out the listings for what's coming up, and don't forget you can scroll back through time to rewatch anything that you may have missed. And I would be particularly interested this evening if you can let me know whether you have a red Bordeaux or indeed a white Bordeaux in your glass. I am going to be drinking something that is known colloquially in France as Chateau de Pompe. And that's actually for a very specific reason, because the wines that I were looking for to talk about value in Bordeaux were just not available anywhere I checked. I've spent the last week looking online and going into supermarkets trying to find value Bordeaux. I had quite a few different options, and I'm afraid to say that there was absolutely no luck. And that, I think, tells you a little something about what you need to know about finding value in Bordeaux. However, whether I've got a glass of water or wine in front of me doesn't make any difference to being able to talk to you and explain to you about how to find value in Bordeaux. So I'm going to jump straight into that. I've got some slides and I'm going to go through all of the factors that I think are important in terms of how value can be found in Bordeaux. So let's jump in straight away. This is what I'm going to talk about. Here's my structure for this evening's webinar. 5 points there. We're going to talk about why Bordeaux, first of all. Then we need to define what value means. That's perhaps one of the trickiest parts of this whole equation. I'm going to share some statistics with you, just a few key statistics that reveal a lot about why Bordeaux is as it is. Then we've got the classifications to consider. So as you all are aware, I'm sure, the 1855 classification was a vital part in defining the best wines of Bordeaux, ostensibly. So we're going to talk about whether that helps us explain value and look at some other classifications as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk about value in terms of drinking versus investment before, at the very end, trying to decide whether there is a secret formula to getting it right every time. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do. And as I say, I would love to hear your comments in the chat if you want to share with us what you're drinking or comment on any of the opinions I'm about to share with you. So first of all, why Bordeaux? Well, I mean, there's a very obvious reason that it is still the premier fine wine region for Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot-based wines. And of course, not forgetting sweet wines made from Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon, and some dry white wines too, although of course there's the competition from Burgundy and the Loire and elsewhere. But really for reds made from Cabernet and Merlot, Bordeaux still stands alone. I think we probably all agree that the great Cabernet wines from Australia, or perhaps most significantly the Napa Valley in California, have got very, very similar quality potential. They've certainly got very, very similar prices in many cases. And yet, Bordeaux remains the most intriguing and perennially popular region. And we can see that with the success of the 2019 En Primeur campaign, which has just been happening. You know, despite all of the circumstances we find ourselves in, people were still willing to spend significant amounts of money on buying wine 18 months or more before they're actually going to lay their hands on the bottles, because it's Bordeaux. Is it rare? Not often, actually. There's quite a lot of Bordeaux being made. Certainly, if you look at the secondary market, there's huge amounts of Bordeaux available. You know, and anybody can look on a broker's website or go to a merchant and find a huge choice of top Bordeaux from many, many vintages and covering a wide range of prices. But Bordeaux has this attraction to us, and there must be some good reason. Quality is surely one of them. You know, the best quality Bordeaux really does still have something magical about it. And not only that, but Bordeaux is huge. I'll give you the precise numbers when I come to the statistics section. It's so massive. And we've all heard of perhaps the top 5 first growths, and I'm sure the equivalents in Saint-Emilion. And yet there are hundreds of chateaux that we will have never heard of. And that makes it intriguing. Which of those are making wines that might be comparable to some of the great brands that we know of? So Bordeaux is a really obvious candidate for trying to find the best value. Now we have to define value. And here are a few factors that you could consider as part of this. The first one is quality to price ratio. Okay, this is a pretty standard definition of value for anything. What are you getting for the price? Now, let's take an example of, let's say, Chateau Lafite, but you could pick on any of the top wines, Alzone in Saint-Emilion, Petrus, whatever you wanted. Are those wines good value for the price you have to pay? They have a premium on them as some of the best known, most famous, and to a certain extent, most sought after wines. They might be 2 or 3 times the price of a second growth or a third growth, you know, especially some of the wines which are really well respected, like Léoville Barton comes to mind as a wine which can often be compared to the first growth in terms of scores and in terms of critical appraisal, and yet is always cheaper. So finding the best quality for price is really important. And yet price is totally relative. You know, for a lot of people who drink wine, spending more than, let's say, 30 or 40 Singapore dollars per bottle would be impossible in their world. And yet we're talking about wines which are hundreds and hundreds and thousands in some cases of dollars per bottle. So it's very much in the eye of the beholder. And I'm afraid that is going to be a consistent theme in this session. I can tell you what I think is good value, but that doesn't mean that you would necessarily agree. And it really relates to the sort of money that you would spend normally on wine for everyday drinking, what you might spend for wine for a special occasion, whether you have a kind of investment portfolio where you're buying investment grade Bordeaux and other wines that you're spending specifically more on because you think that they will appreciate in value. All of those things define quality to price ratio. Critical appraisal is another thing that people consider in terms of the value. If a wine gets 100 points from the Wine Advocate, it has got a value attached to it people think that that is going to be a great wine. Now, you can agree or disagree with the concept of scores, but they are not going anywhere. Scores are a vital part of how we understand wine these days. And yes, it is just one person's opinion of one particular bottle at one moment in time, and those variables can change. But even so, 100 points from somebody like Neil Martin, perhaps, who writes for Vinous.com, is very much a value statement. You know, you are getting 100 points worth of wine for this price. And so that gives a sense of value to the wine. And then there's the third factor of personal attachment. And this, of course, is entirely down to the individual. I'm sure that all of us have had experiences with wines on a special occasion or while visiting the vineyard for an anniversary dinner or on our wedding day, which will forever associate that particular wine with something very dear to us. And it may even be the case that you don't actually think that the wine in question is necessarily the best in its field. You might have had wines which are better ostensibly, or which perhaps have better quality to price ratio. And yet that personal connection is really vital in wine, because otherwise we're just buying something based on, you know, a financial statement, or we're buying something because somebody else thinks it tastes good. And there is no substitute for having that personal, emotional attachment to wine. Here's one that I've got. So the lady you're looking at there is Sylvie Courcelle, and she runs Chateau Thieully, that's the bottle there, with her sister in the Entre-deux-Mers region of Bordeaux. So a big, big region with very, very few quality producers. You know, there's certainly no classified growths. It's a region which is not expensive in terms of the wines it produces. In fact, it's a region which is really under pressure, that very difficult to make money there. And Chateau Thieully is a little known brand. You probably haven't heard of it. It's sold by the Wine Society in the UK, as it happens. I visited Sylvie and her sister in 2015. I took this picture. You know, she's standing by her vines. Her father bought the property, and Sylvie and her sister inherited it and now run it. They run a little wine club. They've made a few more sort of more ambitious cuvées. They invited us into their home. We had dinner with them. We drank some of their older vintages. You know, it was a really wonderful, genuine, welcoming experience. And the wines are delicious. Now, in terms of scores, I score wines out of 20 for JancysRobinson.com, and I'd be putting them around 16, maybe 16 and a half. So, you know, these are not top-end wines by any stretch of the imagination. They're good wines, and, you know, for their price, they're about £15 in the UK, I believe. So that might translate to sort of, let's say, $40 or $50 over here. For me, that's great value, because I love the wine knowing what I do about the Courcelle sisters and their history, and remembering that occasion of having dinner with them, you know, 5 years ago. Would that same thing work for you? Well, I mean, if I tell the story compellingly enough, perhaps you would have some of that sort of experience through tasting the wine. But I wouldn't expect you to suddenly think that this wine is a great value Bordeaux. Bearing in mind that I've told you that, you know, it's good at a standard, but there are lots of other wines that could claim to be as good from the Bordeaux region, which perhaps have more resonance with you personally. So personal attachment is so vital when we're talking about value. Okay, we're going to come on to some statistics now. And here's the most important facts about Bordeaux, I think, in terms of considering the region as a whole, and then how value relates to that. 112,000 hectares of vineyard currently. I've taken these figures from the Oxford Companion to Wine, the latest edition. So they're a few years out of date, but we can assume that that's about correct. So 112,000 hectares. Burgundy has 28,000 hectares. So it's what, 5 times the size of Burgundy? And the whole of New Zealand has 35,000 hectares. Bordeaux is big. It is the biggest appellation region in France, in fact. And so there is a huge choice of wine coming out of Bordeaux. And at the lower end, you know, once you get out of the classed growths and the famous Pomerols, the market is awash with cheap, often pretty average quality Bordeaux. Now, it has this famous name associated with it, but that doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to buy it. And in fact, the prices are just quite depressed, as I will show you very shortly. So the production from these 112,000 hectares is 5.5 million hectolitres. So a hectolitre is 100 litres. And if you do the maths, that is about 733 million bottles every year. Now, of course, that varies year to year according to vintage, and it can vary quite significantly. So this is a long-term average, but 733 million bottles. I mean, that is quite extraordinary. The top first growths of Pauillac can make, I believe I'm right in saying, 250,000 cases of wine a year. So that is a lot of wine that they are making in a region that produces a lot of wine. So, you know, this is a large-scale region. Now, on the one hand, that gives us huge amounts of choice. On the other hand, it makes it incredibly difficult for any standard consumer who doesn't have on-the-ground expertise to find who these best producers are. The classed growths themselves are less than 5% of that total volume. So when you add up all of the producers in the 1855 classification, they aren't making even 5% of the volume. So 95% of the stuff being made in Bordeaux is the stuff you have never heard of. You know, hundreds of millions of bottles of Bordeaux that you've never heard of the chateau, and most likely you'll never even see it. And then I just added there at the bottom, there are 600 estates in the Medoc alone. So 600 estates making several different labels. And then you've got cooperatives. And then, of course, you've got the right bank, and you've got the Entrée de Mer, that region where Chateau Thieully is based. So thousands of producers, thousands of different labels, and each of them making tens of thousands of bottles with each of their cuvées. You know, it is a bewildering amount of choice. No prizes for naming this chateau, one of the first growths. I'll give you a second to just drink that in. It is, of course, Chateau Margaux. Now, I took this picture and, you know, it is completely perfect, this chateau. Absolutely beautiful. Clearly very well maintained. And we had a visit there and a tasting. And it was everything you would expect, which is very grand, welcoming, not cold, but very much a luxury product. And that association of luxury, of course, is all part of value. A lot of people will be buying Chateau Margaux, not because they think the blend of Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot is fantastic, or they particularly like the toast levels of the new oak that's being used there. No, they're going to be buying it because of what we're looking at there, because of the luxury element, because it's something to impress people, because it's something that, you know, we have in our cellars when we want to show off. And also, of course, because it's a fantastic wine. Yeah, no question, Margaux is a superb wine. So from Chateau Margaux to this. This is the largest cooperative in Bordeaux. It is the largest producer of appellation level wines in the country and very possibly in the world. Look at these massive, massive tanks. I've got some more pictures of this in a moment. You know, we visited this place because we wanted to see the business end of Bordeaux, okay? You know, these tanks are absolutely full to the brim of entry-level red Bordeaux. Does anybody know where this is? It's a bit harder. There are lots of chai, as they're called, cellars, which have very similar layouts. You know, these beautifully presented barrels with the stained middle there. These would have been stained deliberately, but originally, you know, they were supposed to absorb the red wine that gets spilled over the top. Of course, it's all staged, managed carefully now. Any ideas on what that one might be? It is, in fact, Chateau Montrose. So another classed growth, another luxury product, less well known than Margaux. But I mean, you can tell just by looking at this picture that this is a successful estate, you know, which is able to create a beautiful space for their barrels to sit in. Back to the business end. This is a winemaker throwing oak chips on Bordeaux grapes before they get fermented. I don't know whether that's Merlot or Cabernet, and frankly, she probably doesn't know either. This is formula winemaking, okay? And French oak chips, invented by the French. In fact, it's not even chips, is it? It's she's throwing in basically sawdust to give flavor, to add structure. Now, of course, that sawdust will be filtered out, it will be pressed and everything, you won't get it in the final wine. And most people would be absolutely horrified at the idea of this happening in Bordeaux, of all places. You know, often people assume that this is something that's done in, I don't know, the Central Valley of Chile or the Riverland of Australia. You know, there are lots of bulk wine areas making cheap, cheerful, everyday brands where the association is they're going to be using techniques such as this. But no. This is something that originates in France and is absolutely critical to how some of the wines are made. Here's another device that can help explain how Bordeaux works at the bottom end. This is called a Gulf Stream, and it is effectively a form of thermovinification. So what we've got here is a sort of shallow pool of grape juice that is heated up, and the grapes are moved through this system. So you first get some grapes, press them and get the juice in there. And then you move berries through this system so that they warm up, so that they start to break down, and critically, so that some of the unripe, rotten flavors are boiled off. I mean, that is what we're dealing with here. And, you know, to be fair, that's a good thing. You know, this is a way of improving the quality of what might otherwise be really quite unpleasant wine. And I've tasted the wines. This is from the same co-op, incidentally. So I've tasted the wines that were made from here, and they're fine. You know, they're 15 out of 20, maybe, in terms of scoring. You know, that's not too bad. 14 and a half, perhaps. That's okay. And they're terribly, terribly cheap. You know, these are wines that are very difficult to sell. Does that make them good value? Well, that's such a tricky thing to answer, isn't it? I mean, you know, they are underpriced for what they are, probably. And yet, somebody that loves Bordeaux would not find them good value. It doesn't matter how cheap they are. It just doesn't deliver what you want from Bordeaux. It doesn't give you the magic. It doesn't have the complexity, the length. It doesn't have the terroir. You know, this stuff comes from all over the Bordeaux region. It's all blended together and chucked in those massive, massive vats with a load of oak dust and who knows what else. You know, that's just the reality of winemaking. Does that make it value? For some people, you know, that will be fine. For people who want to travel down to Bordeaux, maybe buy a couple of bottles in the supermarket for €2 or €3 each, they might be perfectly happy with that. But I suspect that people who are tuning into a £67 Mal webinar will be looking a little bit higher. Even so, this is interesting, isn't it? About the two ends of winemaking in Bordeaux, the contrast. Look, that's the destiny of some of this bulk Bordeaux. Now, this was taken 5 years ago, either 5 years ago or 7 years ago. And look, back then, €2.35 for a litre of Bordeaux Rouge AOC, 12 degrees alcohol. That already tells you something. When a wine is sort of that low in alcohol, it's bound to be dilute. And look, you just take your own container, put the pump in there, press it, fill it up, go and get it measured, and then you pay, you can take your 5 litres of Bordeaux away for just a little bit over €10. I mean, it's little wonder that these producers aren't able to reinvest. They're not able to kind of improve the quality and offer a better value proposition. But then for a lot of people, this is what they want. They want to be drinking cheap, cheap, affordable, however you want to label it, red Bordeaux. Okay, now let's have a look at the classifications. And this is quite interesting stuff because some of it I'm sure you'll be familiar with, but you may not know the full details of what these classifications tell us and whether they help tell us anything about value. There are, in fact, 5 classification systems in Bordeaux. The Grand Cru Classé from 1855, that's the most famous one. Then there's the Cru Classé de Grave, which is much less well known, but still important. The Grand Cru of Saint-Emilion is probably the second most important after the Grand Cru Classé of 1855. And I'm going to explain a bit more about all of these in just a moment. We have Cru Bourgeois. This, for me, is one of the most important for value. It's not a fail-safe, but I'll explain to you why I think it's really worth knowing about. And then finally, Cru Artisan, a tiny classification that I must confess I hadn't come across. It's only a handful of chateaux that are classified in that way, and I'm not really sure whether it helps much, but let's have a look at it. So, the Grand Cru Classé of 1855. So originally, they were basically ranked by price. The Bordeaux Chamber of Commerce drew up a list of the best, most expensive Bordeaux chateau at the time, and put them in a list and put them in 5 different rankings. And ever since then, this has been taken as the gospel truth for what good Bordeaux, how good Bordeaux is defined. There was one change, of course, which was Mouton Rothschild being promoted from second to first growth in 1973. Otherwise, this classification hasn't changed at all. Now, some of the chateaux that were originally classified don't actually exist anymore. So, arguably, it's out of date in many, many ways. And of course, we know about those chateaux who overperform, these so-called super seconds. And they might not actually be second growths, they might be third, fourth, or fifth growths, but they've come to have the reputation that makes them comparable with the top wines. So there's an awful lot of incongruity, actually, in how this classification works. And yet, those 5 first growths, they are still sacrosanct, really. They are still considered to be the best expression of classic left bank Bordeaux. So they were ranked by price, but it's interesting that they weren't classified by their vineyards. It was really by the brand. It was looking at how the wine performs on the market. So it has since been possible for these producers to expand their vineyard areas, and many of them have. You may have read recently an article by Jane Anson for Club Enologique magazine, and that's where I've taken this statistic from. It's really fascinating because it deals with how producers in Bordeaux are increasing the surface area of their vineyard and whether that's detrimental to quality. So Chateau Lascaume was 17 hectares in 1855 and it's now 120. Jane's argument was, of course, that it's not in their favour to classify their wines or to somehow dilute the quality in any way. They may be increasing the surface area, but perhaps that's going for their second wines, or it's allowing them to get certain plots that they can really improve and, you know, make the Grand Vin much, much better. Now, of course, they would say that, but, you know, I trust Jane's opinion. And I think, you know, if top estates were just buying any old rubbish vineyard and chucking the grapes into their vats, we'd all be able to tell from the quality. So I think it's an intriguing system, the 1855 classification. Does it tell us anything about value? It might have done in 1855 when it was looking at, you know, which had the most expensive wines with the best reputation. But I think today, it probably doesn't really help at all. I think it can be a good signpost for people who are newcomers to Bordeaux, who are just discovering things, who want to have a sort of shortcut to see who some of the top producers are that they should check out. Does that make it good value? I really don't think it does. I think that the top wines of the 1855 classification, in fact, could be classified as bad value. I think it's almost a guarantee that those wines are overpriced in terms of their quality to price ratio. That doesn't stop people drinking them and enjoying them. But when you know what else is out there at a fraction of the price, you know, people who like to drink widely and are happy to try Bordeaux Merlot blends, Cabernet Merlot blends from elsewhere in the world, you know, they're bound to think that there are better options. The Grand Cru Classé de Grave was started in 1953. They're all in the appellation of Pessac-Léognan, which is an enclave of the Grave region. Just 16 chateaux classified, and that includes Haut-Brion. So Chateau Haut-Brion, which is in the Premier Grand Cru Classé of 1855, was also a Cru Classé de Grave. Now, like the 1855 classification, this is out of date, frankly, but again, it gives you another set of options to consider when you are looking at what are the best chateau in a particular region. So that's Grave specific. Now let's look at the Saint-Emilion classification. This is one of the most interesting because unlike the previous two, they update it. So it started in 1954 and it's revised every 10 years or thereabouts. And very often it's accompanied by horrible controversy, court cases, litigation, all sorts of bad blood between producers who feel like they've been left out or that their neighbour isn't worthy of a better ranking than they are. It's incredibly political. So in 2012, the most recent set of classifications was released, and there are 4 Premier Grand Cru Classé, 14, sorry, that's the A list. So they have to separate Premier Grand Cru Classé now into A list and regular. 4 Premier Grand Cru Classé A, and they are, see if I can remember them, Chateau Alzone, Chateau Angelus, Chateau Cheval Blanc, and I can't remember the 4th. Tell us in the chat if you can. That's the 4 top ones anyway. 14 Premier Grand Cru Classé alongside those. So they're in the same Premier Grand Cru Classé club, but they're not the A-listers. And then there's 64 Grand Cru Classé. Now, to make this even more complicated, there is an appellation called Saint-Emilion Grand Cru. And that applies to virtually all of the Saint-Emilion region, but it is not the same as Grand Cru Classé, which is so confusing. But it really doesn't help because you can write Saint-Emilion Grand Cru on your appellation Grand Cru Saint-Emilion that might be very cheap and not particularly good. And the implication is that it's somehow classified, Classé, a lot like this list. Anyway, the way that they determine the classification every 10 years or so considers the terroir, so that's different to 1855 already. There are tasting panels, blind tastings, where, you know, committees decide what is good and what's classic and what is unrepresentative, maybe. It considers the history of the estate. Does this estate have a track record of producing top wine? And the reputation in the market is obviously bound to be relevant. Plus, pricing is considered as well. And there are probably many other factors. they try to make it a comprehensive overview of a wine, of a producer. You know, do they have the history to be trustworthy? Have they got the right kind of terroir? You know, what are the prices of their wines? Now, I would argue that this is a much, much better way of assessing value and quality, because it's revised on a regular basis, and it doesn't just consider, you know, the price of a wine. It's looking at the terroir and the quality, the tasting of the actual wine. So I think this is probably quite a safe bet. Now, of course, you and I may not agree that we like all of these wines that are classified the same. And of course, you know, that's not the point. The point is that this gives you a subset of wines to look at, okay? There are here 78, 82 Chateaux. Still quite a large number, but you could have quite a lot of fun working through those Chateaux. And up at the top end, Premier Grand Cru Classé A list, you know, the prices are pretty prohibitive. You're not likely to find value there. But in the Grand Cru Classé list, there might be lots of wines that are worth checking out there. And there are chateaux that have become favourites among wine lovers, wines which offer, you know, good value and have this classification as a kind of backup. Now let's have a look at Cru Bourgeois, because like the Saint-Emilion classification, I think this is a really useful insight into how to find value. Now, the Cru Bourgeois classification is just as complicated as any other wine world legislation. You know, whenever it's updated and released, there is controversy. But the current setup, which has been announced this year, is that there will be 3 different types of Cru Bourgeois. There'll be Cru Bourgeois Supérieur, and Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnel. So they are like 1855 and like Saint-Emilion. They are subdividing the quality of their wines. Nowadays, it applies for 5 years, this classification, whereas previously, in the 10 most recent vintages, they would reassess literally every single wine. Now, I think actually the reassessment every year was a really useful way of having that snapshot, not just of good quality from producers who aren't particularly well known in many cases, but it was also a good snapshot of the vintage, because not every producer performs well in every vintage. So you might get one producer being included in the 2017 classification, then excluded from the 2018 classification. So in a way, it's a shame that that has been lost. On the other hand, this 5-year period incentivizes the producers to maintain that standard, so that, you know, it vindicates their choice being on that list for 5 years. And also the tasters, when they're assessing these wines, are looking at multiple vintages. So they're actually tasting the wines over several different years. So you get a sense of the ageability as well. So you could argue that this is quite a good system. And certainly it really helps in terms of value. The Cru Bourgeois Chateaux tend to be little known in most cases. You know, I look at the list and I've never heard of 90% of the producers on that list. They're coming from all sorts of obscure satellite appellations, you know, so they're not likely to be coming from the big ticket names. I think there may be 1 or 2 in Pauillac. There may be a few more in Saint-Estèphe or Saint-Julien, but a lot of them are coming from lesser known appellations, the Haute-Médoc, perhaps. And so you're seeing there a snapshot of, remember those hundreds and hundreds of producers that there are in Bordeaux, a snapshot of the most ambitious and those who are able to achieve a certain level of quality, yet aren't going to be charging the sorts of prices that are associated with the 1855 classification. And the classification for Cru Bourgeois considers tasting. It also considers sustainability, which is interesting. So they look at vineyard practices and see how environmentally sustainable they are. But then it also considers things like tourism. Like I think whether you have got a car park or not for visitors is part of whether you should be classified as cru bourgeois. Now, I get the logic there. They're trying to encourage producers to make themselves open to guests, to be welcoming. But that really doesn't change the taste of the wine, does it? Now, I suppose you want to see the producer as a holistic entity, and there are going to be lots of different factors that are important in how we get that emotional connection with the producer, like I talked about at the beginning. But having a car park probably won't make a huge amount of difference. Anyway, that's part of the story. And, cru bourgeois is one of the things that I often look for on labels. They had, and I think still have, a seal that they put over the top, over the capsule on top of the bottle, that has the cru bourgeois logo. And I think it's got a QR code so you can scan and find out information about that wine. So if you see that, it's really worth checking out. Now, I said earlier that I couldn't find a red Bordeaux to buy for this session that I really wanted. And there were several cru bourgeois that I wanted to go and check out. And this just illustrates how difficult it is. I was going through supermarkets and retailers and looking online and was unable to find a cru bourgeois from, a decent vintage at a reasonable price. Because I wanted to have that typical value wine. If I'd have been able to get hold of Chateau Thierry, I would have bought it in a flash, no question. Unfortunately, it's not exported to Singapore as far as I can tell. But remember, the reason that I love that wine so much is much more about a personal, emotional connection. I think it's a delicious wine, like I said, and I think it's great value, but I wouldn't necessarily expect everybody to agree. Finally, let's just take a quick look at the cru artisan classification. I wasn't familiar with this one. It only came into being in 1989. It's revised every 5 years. It's just based in the Medoc, and there are 36 properties. Now, judging from their website, which looked like it was also made in 1989, they haven't got an awful lot of money between them. And, this is not a particularly well-known classification. So I'm not sure that this particularly helps, I will be very honest. Certainly, I can't see how this would give you any kind of value judgment. They've qualified for something, but I'm not sure whether that something is particularly helpful or relevant. By the way, we're coming towards the end of this webinar now, but if you have got any questions, now would be the time to put it in the Q&A box, and I will get to them over the next few moments. If we don't have any questions, it may be that we finish slightly early. But we still need to talk about the value for drinking versus the value for investment. Now, here are 3 ways that people often buy Bordeaux. They would buy it en primeur for trading. So that might be companies or it might be individuals. And you have your favorite chateau that you're buying because you think that they will improve in price over a time period, at which point you can sell them and have the profit. Now, some people find the idea of trading wine in that way unfortunate, but it's a fact of life. There are now hundreds of companies around the world who are doing this. And, the truth of the matter is that wine is a finite product. And so the best wines, the most sought after wines, will go up in value as they become more scarce over the years. But then there's another alternative to en primeur buying, which is when you're buying it for cellaring. So you're buying it for yourself, you're going to cellar it, you're going to, I guess, intend to drink it or maybe pass it on to your children. That, of course, is a old-fashioned way of doing things. Although actually, en primeur trading didn't really come in until the 70s, I believe. But it's become established as quite a traditional way of buying wine now. You buy wine through your merchant, they cellar it for you, or perhaps you have it at home if you're very lucky. And then, after your 10 or 20 year period, you can finally open this wine that you've been holding on to all of that time. So that's different because you're not buying wine that you think will go up in value necessarily. You're buying wine because you think it's great value, because you've tasted it, hopefully, and you think that this is a delicious wine at the price. And then there's just buying wine to drink. You know, you can buy Bordeaux at mature vintages for great prices these days. And in fact, that's one of the things that makes Entrepreneur slightly questionable in a way. So if you're just buying to drink, then you know your value is in something that you're going to consume straight away. You're not thinking about the long term. You're not thinking about reselling it. You're not considering cellaring costs or anything like that. You're buying it now to drink now. And you know that might be a 1982 vintage. It might be a 1990 vintage. It might be a 2015 vintage if you prefer your wines younger. And of course, you can go way, way back into the 60s and 50s and 40s and so on. But the point is that the value here is in something that it gives you an immediate return. You know, you see this bottle of wine, let's say it's going to cost you $100, special occasion, you think, yes, have that, drink it now, and you know, that is good value for me. Here are some screen grabs of some graphs. I know everybody loves looking at graphs at 7:45 on a Monday evening, which give you some indication of value for certain chateaux. I mentioned Léoville-Barton earlier. So here's a look at 4 different vintages of Léoville-Barton. And what we're seeing here is a calculation of the score from jancisrobinson.com and how the price relates to that score. So how much excellence you get for your money. So if all of these wines had scored the same score, but have different prices, then obviously the cheapest of them is going to be the best value because all other things are equal and therefore you just buy the one which is cheapest. So it looks like the newly released 2019 Chateau Léoville-Barton is the best value because it's got the longest graph here, whereas the 2010 is the worst value. So in that case, the 2010 has got a high price for a score that isn't relatively that good. And the 16 and 18, you can see there, slightly better value, but the 19 Léoville-Barton is best value. I've got another one here that's showing Pontet Canet. And this shows you that the 2006 is way, way out in front there in terms of value. So the 2019 newly released seems like a bad buy. You know, if you're literally wanting a wine that's going to give you the best quality for the price, and you like Chateau Pontet Canet, then why would you buy the 2019 over the 2006? You know, the 06 will be drinking now. It may not have been a legendary vintage, but it's a wine that will be very good for enjoying right now. You don't have to cellar it. It looks like it's very, very good value. It's not going to be a particularly high price for what you're getting. It must have scored quite well. By comparison, look at the 09. You know, the 09 was a vintage which got great reviews at the time, but it looks like the worst value because the Entrepreneur prices were so high, and you know, these wines may not have aged as well as people thought they were, and the scores have been reassessed, and you know, suddenly you're looking at a wine which just doesn't look like good value at all. So if you bought some 09 Pontet Canet Entrepreneur, is it going to be easy to sell on the secondary market? Perhaps not. So look, that was just a snapshot of different ways of trying to find value in Bordeaux. And it leaves us with this question: how do you find value in Bordeaux? It's the end of my slideshow, so I'm going to turn that off now and just talk to you with my glass of Chateau de Pompe. How do you find value in Bordeaux? I'd love to say that there's a list of 20 chateaux, which are the fail-safe options here. But we've seen from the scale of Bordeaux that it is just not possible to come up with something that will be correct. You know, many classification systems exist within Bordeaux precisely to try and give us guidance on what great wine is, where you can find it, who's producing it, and how much it costs. And those are terribly flawed as well. Paul Brakefield makes a comment there in terms of buying wine to keep, when the person that's buying would actually like to drink the wine. So yes, if you know you're not intending to drink the wine in 20 years' time, you know, for whatever reason, then there's no point in buying Entrepreneur. And you know, unless you're going to pass it on or whatever, or you know, so yeah. Having the sense of when to drink it is really vital too. And of course, at what stage of the wine that you are going to like it the most. It may be that you prefer it at 10 years old than you do at 20 years old. By the time you get to 20 years old, of course, it's too late. You can't turn back the clock. Anyway, I was going to say that with a region so big and with so many classification systems, none of which give us a true indication of value, there is just no way of producing a definitive guide to choosing value. I think that the Saint-Emilion classification and the Cru Bourgeois especially classification are some of the best ways, but it still requires each individual to look into that list and to taste preferably. And then perhaps most importantly of all, to have a good emotional reason, a good sort of personal investment in the chateau, whether that's because you go and visit it or because you have it on a special occasion, it really doesn't matter. But that's what brings us great enjoyment in wine. Yes, we all love the idea of getting a bargain, getting a wine that's underpriced. There should be no shortage of choices in Bordeaux of underpriced wines. But then don't forget there's all that stuff which is thermo-vinified and with oak dust added, which, you know, is fine and won't particularly excite you, and maybe kind of good value in one way because it's just cheap. But will that satisfy you? You know, if what you're looking for is kind of the great undiscovered first growth, of course, that's not going to happen. So I would just encourage you to find a subset of Bordeaux that interests you, that intrigues you, and really explore it. You know, go out like I have done and try and find these wines, buy them, and that's not always easy. Buy them and taste them. Do it with friends, you know, do it in tasting groups, do it at restaurants, you know, ask sommeliers to recommend things. And that's going to be the way to start building up how you discover the best value in Bordeaux. And you may think I'm kind of trying to avoid the, the subject of the webinar, but I'm really not, because I think that is actually the most important part of it. The process of finding these wines is what makes it so enjoyable. It's not the same if you just copy somebody else's top 10 and buy those wines. You know, that's not going to deliver the same satisfaction. You know, there is no shortage of lists on the internet that top 50 films and best 100 albums of the last decade and all that kind of stuff. You could do that with the wines of Bordeaux, but you don't get that personal connection to it. So I think that pretty much brings me to the end of this webinar. We're a little before the end of the hour, so we all get to go home early, which is fantastic. I'm just going to give you a very brief plug for the next webinar that I'm doing, which is on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Singapore time, midday in the UK. And that is with a Châteauneuf du Pape producer called Chateau de la Font du Loup. And we're going to have the winemaker with us, Anne Charlotte. She's fantastic. She visits Singapore often. She really loves it here. She knows the city. She knows the restaurants. She's got an importer over here. They're called Sarment. And we've bought wine from them that many members have bought from us, who are going to be sharing it on Wednesday. So Wednesday at 7 o'clock, please do join us if you want to, whether you've got the wine or not. It's going to be really interesting. They're a great Châteauneuf du Pape producer from the coolest terroir. It's got really high elevation and they get the cooling Mistral through their vineyards. So they get quite a delicate, relatively, comparatively for Châteauneuf, a kind of delicate style to their wines. So I very much hope you can join us then. Look out for the Singapore mailing list coming out tomorrow, which is going to give you a sneak preview of some of the events we've got coming up. I'll just let you into a secret. We've got wines coming from Pierre Gonon, Chateau d'Etours and Tignanello, all of which will be available to buy at best prices delivered to you in Singapore. So check that out. It will be coming into your inboxes tomorrow. And if you want to know about value, that is going to be, there's going to be some really good buys there. I'm quite excited about those. So that brings me to the end of this webinar. Thanks once again for everyone who joined in. Very good to see you all and see you again soon, I hope. Cheers. Bye-bye now.